Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to get into predictors of marital satisfaction. And so this entire topic comes from a paper I am writing for school, literally.
So we're all helping with your research project.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
So I have to write a literature review, but I had to do a lot of research about this topic.
Is this the first literature review you've done?
Yes.
Yeah. And so depending on what degree you go for, like if you had for a PhD, then when you do, depending if you're doing a master's or a PhD, you will get used to doing the literature review because as you make a proposal, you'll have to do that.
Right. And it was a good learning experience. I think the hardest part was everything else I had to do on top of research. Anyways, long story short, last week was a really, really busy week for me. Academically and life, everything. It was just really busy. So one of the things that I would say is the biggest indicator, according to the research I found, is self-compassion, which I thought was interesting. And forgiveness kind of went along with this, but the one that came up the most was self-compassion. And I would say overall positivity in your relationship is kind of this overall interpretation that I got of this. And so let's talk about that. I'm curious your experience in terms of self-compassion, what your opinion is professionally, as well as your experience with couples and self-compassion being a big indicator of marital satisfaction.
So just at the outset, we're going to go over, it looks like there are 6 different things. I agree with all of them, just so you know.
Okay.
And I've seen them all as being factors in relationships. And in fact, just this morning with a couple. So self-compassion, often, I think it has to do, I think almost always, there's some sort of family of origin issue.
Okay.
That either you're feeling like you aren't good enough or you're inadequate, something like that. And we're going to use, I think throughout this episode, we'll use that word we've used several episodes, narrative. And so you create this narrative about yourself that you aren't good enough or that you do things wrong. I mean, it takes many different forms, but I think self-compassion to me is just this idea that you treat yourself well and that it's okay that we make mistakes. Because in marriage, well, in life, but in marriage as well, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to screw up sometimes. We're going to say things sometimes that are wrong. And this ties into the second one that's there, which is forgiveness. And so you both play a part, right?
Okay.
In a marriage, because let's say we're married and actually I've done this throughout the years. We've both done this to each other, Lindy and I, where I say something that I shouldn't have said. I didn't think about it. And so the 2 parts, one, the self-compassion is not to beat myself up.
Yes.
And it doesn't surprise you how many people come in, both men and women, that once they do something wrong, they have this incredibly negative self-talk, which is, oh, you're stupid, or you're this, or you're that. And from my experience, that almost always comes from family of origin issues. But then the partner, so in this case, if I said something that was either mean or uncaring or unkind to Lindy, then equally important is she has to be able to forgive me for that.
Yeah.
Or so you can move on. Because and I do see couples who they don't know how to forgive. It's like they're carrying along all these marital infractions that happen, throughout the years that you're married. And that's just a lot of baggage. And so, when we talk about the baggage we carry around, that's really how I visualize it, as you're carrying around the suitcase full of these things that your partner said to you that were not kind. But what goes along with that is you really need to make an effort to change that. So if you just think, oh, I can say unkind things and I'll be nice to myself. And actually, I've heard people say this as well. Oh, that's just who I am. Well, that's not going to work long term.
No,
because part of it is, yes, I'm willing to forgive you if you also make an effort to change this.
Yeah.
And, knowing that change doesn't come immediately, but, if you're working on it. So, yeah, I believe self-compassion is really important. You have to treat yourself kindly, I think, before you can treat others kindly, is what it comes down to.
Sounds like self-esteem
Yeah.
is it's an important factor. And that makes sense, because if you have low self-esteem, if you don't feel good about yourself, it's going to be hard to feel good about anybody else.
Yeah. The low self-esteem or lack of self-compassion we've talked about how our brains are really focused on the negative. And I think it tends to shift us really into that negative territory.
Okay.
Pretty strongly. And so I think feeling good about ourselves or being kind to ourselves helps us to shift more to that positive territory.
Okay. And another thing that this makes me think of is shame versus guilt.
Yeah.
And that sounds really important here, because, shame, you're internalizing it and you're taking this on as, I messed up. That means I'm a bad person. Whereas guilt is a very important emotion and a very important part of good relationships, because guilt is just your mind's way of unconsciously saying, I didn't do a very good job in that situation, or I need to change something. I need to do something different. So if you can get yourself to a place where you feel guilt for your mistakes, but you don't take it so far as that you feel shame for your mistakes, that's going to go a long way in being self-compassionate.
I think shame is really about a lack of self-compassion in a lot of ways.
Okay.
And so you're right, defining guilt as I made a poor choice and in the future I'm going to really try to make a better choice is very different than saying there is something wrong with me.
Yes.
And again, I think the whole shame thing tends to come a lot from family of origin.
Okay. So another one that I found that I thought was really interesting was high growth orientation. And so
tell me what you understand that to mean.
So high growth orientation, it's another way of self-improvement. So you're always trying to better yourself. And in the research study that I looked at, couples who are satisfied and this is just one research article, but I thought it was still really interesting. Couples who are both always looking to improve have higher satisfaction than if only one individual is looking to improve and the other one just says, I'm good where I am.
Well, this goes back kind of to that self-compassion thing. Like if I say something negative, say to my spouse, or if I do something negative, then that high growth orientation, I think, really says I can change this.
Okay.
I can become a better person emotionally. I think I've mentioned this before, that in the past I have had trouble with anger. Haven't I mentioned that before?
Maybe.
Maybe I haven't, but I have. But I work to change it.
Okay.
And you can change it. And now I'm actually very, very calm. And, there are reasons that I had the anger, again, family of origin issues. But I think that high growth orientation means I don't have to stay the way I am, that I can improve myself, or I can change this thing that either I want to be different or my spouse wants to be different. It reminds me, there's a physician out of Austin, Texas. His name's Peter Attia, which I think I've mentioned before when we talked about longevity. And he wrote a book. If people just Google him, they'll find his latest book. It's about longevity. And what was really striking to hear him talk about this, the very last chapter is on emotional health. Okay. And his publishers, and I think his editor, didn't want him to put this in because it's really about a medical book about what you can do, for longevity. And he persisted. He said, no, this is really important. Yeah. And if people want to go listen to he's talking about it with a guy named Rich Roll, who has his podcast, but he does this incredible job of talking about how he decided this high growth orientation that he was going to be different in his emotional health. It sounds to me, he didn't say this, but it sounds to me like his wife said, you've got to change, or we're going to end this marriage. So he really put himself to it. And I heard him talk on a little podcast today, and he still maintains that the emotional health, or that mental health, is really the most important part of his work, which is longevity. But that just goes along with high growth orientation. We are dynamic through the lifespan.
Yes.
And I think it's really important to see each other growing and changing. You're 10 years married, I think you said 11, 10.
We're coming up on 12 this year.
Well, and so, maybe it's too early to see that because, the change, but, at 40, 46 years into this, Lindy and I really make an effort to change
Hmm.
and to progress. And we do things every day that are helping us grow in different ways. So I do believe it's really important, that high growth orientation. Yeah.
And I agree with what you said, especially about mental health and emotional health. And there's a lot more research about that today that, yeah, that is a big important to your overall health and your overall longevity. Because, I mean, if you have good mental health, you're going to be able to cope with stress better. You're going to have better relationships and you're going to be more positive. All of these things contribute to your physical health
Yeah.
either directly or
Yeah.
indirectly. It's all correlated. So, I mean, another thing that I want to say is about, this dynamic through the lifespan and this change. I look back at where I was when Curtis and I first got married. In a lot of ways, I feel like a completely different person. And I mean, and it's not that Curtis hasn't changed at all. He's certainly grown as a father, but he's more or less the same. And then
Uh,
not that that's a bad thing. I mean, there are ways in which he's grown. I mean, I look back at the person I was when we first got married, and I mean, it's sometimes shocking to me. It's almost like I don't recognize myself, and these are good things. Like I feel like these
yeah.
are all positive changes
Yeah.
that I've made, and I think as a couple in general, it's important that you are changing together. And Curtis didn't necessarily change with me, but he was part of my growth process. He was involved with it.
Right.
And so I think that's an important part of couples is, maybe, and in our instance, Curtis is 5 years older than me, and he also had a very rough childhood. And so
Mhm.
in a lot of ways, he was forced to mature a lot faster. I had a very sheltered, easy life growing up. And so, when I had kids, I matured at almost like this exponential rate for a while. But,
Mhm.
through it all, Curtis and I, we did this together, right? And we were together during this journey of my growth.
Yeah, so I agree with that. When you see couples who are growing together, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the same way,
Yes.
just growing in their own way or together, they tend to be happier and more fulfilled.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because, imagine if just kind of disconnected or distance each other and then we try to come back together. It's like he's married to a whole different person. And is he going
Right.
to recognize me? So,
Right.
think about that in your relationship. So, this next one that we're going to get into, positive relationship narrative, this comes from probably the favorite study that I read. And so I want to talk about this study a little bit and kind of explain to it. And so this study looked at 64 heterosexual couples who were recruited for this study. And the average age of the couples was 71 and 70. And they also,
We're older.
exactly, yes. And so that's the point. And so this study is called the Meta Marriage Links Between Older Coupled Relationship Narratives and Marital Satisfaction.
Hmm.
And they own this in the study that these couples had all of the right things going for them to be satisfied with their relationship, right? And so they had a high average income. They were older. So they also had to make sure that they were competent enough to, like mentally competent enough to be able to take this. And so what this research study found is that couples who had a positive narrative about their relationship in general had higher satisfaction levels. And so, how they conducted the study is they gave couples a narrative task, and the couple sat together and they were asked to talk about different aspects or they were able at different narratives of their lives, and they watched them. They were able to analyze that couples who had a positive narrative had higher satisfaction, which makes a lot of sense. So again, it's this idea that as human beings, we tend to be negative, but if we can focus on the positive, you're going to be happier, right? And your relationship is going to be happier. Your relationship is going to be better if you can focus on positive things.
Right. I'm just guessing that the initial work they looked at was Gottman's. And so he has a method that he trains people in, the Gottman method of doing
Mm-hmm.
couples therapy. And I think I've said before, I don't really think it's a method, but I use this particular thing that he does. So with every couple that he interviews, in that first session, he's going to ask them to give him the narrative. I don't know that he calls it narrative, but tell me the story of how you met.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell whether that narrative comes out positive or negative, the potential success of the relationship.
Yeah.
So he finds it to be a really important marker. And so I do that with couples.
Mm-hmm.
In the first session, typically, I will ask them to talk about how they met. What was that
Mm-hmm.
like? And so you're just watching them as they talk about it. And, it can be positive and they remember these really positive things. That's a good indicator of the potential success of working with a couple. If it's a negative narrative,
Mm-hmm.
then it's really, really hard to change that. And it's because they're in that negative mindset, even about how their relationship started. I think I've said this before. What happens is if one person in the couple has decided they want a divorce,
Mm-hmm.
often what they'll do is they'll shift their narrative. And for things that were clearly positive for them, 20 years ago, if the one person wants out of the marriage, they'll change that to be a negative narrative
Mm-hmm.
and say things like, it was never good. And I've heard people say this, I was never in love with him. And I don't believe it. I don't think I challenge them on that, but I don't believe it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why would you have gotten married? And so if over time you change your narrative to a negative one, that's not a good indicator for the marriage. And so I really believe that the more you can maintain a positive narrative about everything. I mean, we're talking about marriage, but I really believe positive narratives in life are really
Mm-hmm.
important
Yeah.
in general. Because if we have a negative narrative, like about a job, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if you have a negative narrative about a job, it will be more miserable. Maybe it is miserable, and maybe you need to leave. But that's different than getting a divorce.
Yeah.
But sometimes people are stuck in a job and you really have no option but to
Mm-hmm.
change your narrative about the job. And I think people can do that. So same thing about the marriage, you create a positive narrative.
And I remember thinking about this too when I was in high school or even before I got married and how things shift after a breakup. And again, obviously it's different when you're married, but I've thought of that in terms of my own marriage and thinking, asking myself what would I think of all of these positive things that I love about Curtis, or what would that be like if I suddenly had this negative opinion of him? Or would these little things that bothered me, could they escalate to the point where I see him as a totally different person? And that idea bothered me. I mean, I kind of cringed away from it and I shy away from it. And I thought, no, I don't ever want to get to a point where I see him in a negative light.
Yeah.
And it's not that I think of him as just perfect, because I mean, he will own that he's not, but I do think of him as perfect for me because I
Right.
think we work so well together. And so, we have this very positive narrative of how well we fit together and how well we work together.
Hmm.
And I think
Yeah.
couples need to try to find that.
Yeah. Well, one of the exercises I give couples often is to just change the way they talk to each other and only focus on the positive. Now, the couples who are able to do it, and if they have children, I suggest they do it with their children as well. The
Hmm.
couples who do it, just changing their words they use
Yes. Hmm.
makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
They're surprised
Positivity.
at how different you can feel after 1 week of
Hmm.
just positive comments.
Yeah. Right. So this last one is early adaptive schemas. Now, I had to look this up a little bit, or at least I had to look up the word schema because, and I even asked my professor, I was like, tell me what this means.
Well,
Because,
let me see if I've got it. The way I consider schemas is almost like a pattern is the way we see the world,
okay. Yep.
is the way I think of it. So an adaptive schema to me, I also think of rigid or flexible.
Okay.
And I think that if you have developed a schema where you have to be rigid in life, which some people do,
Okay. Yeah.
and I think I mean, there are many reasons, but often it's people who've experienced abuse often have rigid schemas.
Mm.
Also, people who are anxious, recovering addicts. In that way, that's a hard one because it's the way they stay sober, is to
Hmm.
have this really rigid schema. Is that the way you understand schema then?
Yes, that makes sense. And so in this research article in particular that I looked at, it was early adaptive schemas in terms of families of origin
Hmm.
is really kind of what they're talking about. And so the results of this study is that emotional fulfillment is the most meaningful early adaptive schema and equated to relationship quality. So, what I could gather from this study is that kids who are emotionally fulfilled as children grew up to have more emotionally fulfilling and emotionally satisfying relationships and sexual relationships. And so I think what this is talking about in terms of early adaptive schemas is what was your schema like as a child? What was your family of origin situation? Did you connect well with your parents? Because if you connected well with your parents, and if you had good attachment to your parents, you're going to have an easier time attaching to a romantic partner.
Right. And so in doing couples work, attachment is important. And so
Hmm.
it totally makes sense to me that they're talking about attachment in that way and emotional fulfillment in that way. I
Hmm.
think what also would happen if you grew up in a family like that, then the chance that your parents in the family of origin would get a divorce is probably very small. And
Hmm.
one of the statistical factors of longevity in marriage is if your parents are still together, that bodes really well for your own marriage. And
Hmm.
so the early adaptive schemas, as you described it, that certainly makes sense that it's going to be easier. I think it's important for our listeners to understand it doesn't have to be that way.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about next week families of origin. And I'll have to decide how much detail I go into. I didn't grow up in a family like that. I didn't grow up in
Hmm.
a family that was emotionally supportive. And so, but I learned to do it with Lindy,
Yeah.
which kind of incorporates, this high growth orientation, feeling like
Yep.
I really need to change and I really need to learn in order to meet her emotional needs. But I didn't grow up in a family that was that way, but I think I have a really good relationship. So I think the thing with schemas is that they can change.
Yes.
Certainly. All of this ties together as I'm thinking about it, the narrative, the positive narrative,
Hmm.
the early childhood, the attachment. I was thinking that there is an attachment survey that might be interesting for couples if they want to look at this. There's a book called Your Emotional EQ.
Okay.
And in that book, I think it's in the first or the second chapter, there's going to be a link where you can go online and take an attachment
Mm.
survey, and it's
Okay.
really helpful for people to think about it. And it talks about attachment in terms of a romantic partner, friends, mother, father. I think that's it. It splits it up into those, based on the question that you answered. And a lot of couples do find it pretty helpful. And often I will suggest that couples do it as to give information. Because if you've entered the marriage where you didn't have good attachment,
Hmm.
that's something that needs to be addressed. What is it? How do you change it? And so I think that fits into that early adaptive schema.
Okay.
Like if you go to the link, it's going to give you two options. One is they're just asking for permission to use your data. They don't take your name or anything.
Okay.
They just are you asking permission to use your data in their very long-term research project. If you say yes to that, the information you get is much more complete.
Okay.
And if you take the other option, it's fine. But I don't see that there's any reason not to, you know, give them permission because they don't know who you are. And
Okay.
the
No.
the book though does a really good job of talking about attachment in those two chapters. I think it's chapters 1 and 2 or 2 and 3. For
Okay.
for people who don't know about attachment, I think she does a really good job.
Okay. So if anybody is interested in that book, I will have that book in our show notes. So I will have the title and the author so that you can easily look that up.
And I'm just can you put a link in the show notes? Maybe you can put a link to that.
If you send me a link, yes, I can.
Okay, I'm going to send you the link and you can put those in the show notes.
Okay,
So
yeah.
for our
So we'll
listeners, you get the link to this attachment quiz.
okay. Yeah.
Isabel Kirk is the name of the author.
Okay, so before we run out of time, the last thing that I really wanted to get into is divorce rates and marital satisfaction among low socioeconomic couples. And so the reason why I bring this up is because several of the research articles mention that there's not a lot of research done on this. All of the research that has been done has been in more of middle class or upper class couples. And one study that I talked about in particular was talking about how it's not that low socioeconomic couples have less marital satisfaction, it's that they experience marriage differently because they have different struggles. And now the divorce rate is high among low socioeconomic, or higher, I should say, among low socioeconomic couples. And a lot of that is they don't have the resources and the means to get therapy, because therapy, not only is it very expensive, but for some bizarre reason it's not, or marital couple in general isn't covered by insurance.
Yeah, there's not a bizarre reason. It's Medicare.
No.
So it's just that Medicare actually sets. So if a couple comes into me in Medicare and they want couples, it's not covered. And so what happens is insurance companies take the cue from what Medicare will cover. That's how it.
Mm.
And so what I tell couples is there is no insurance plan in the country that covers if you say I want couples therapy, it won't cover it. We get around that by doing it under family therapy. But
Okay.
so in some cases you can get it covered, but a lot of plans, like our plan here, the University of Utah is one of the biggest employers, at least in the city, right?
Hmm.
They exclude any type of family coverage. And so, so here we live in a state which
Hmm.
says, we support the family. Family is important.
Yes.
One of the largest employers will not cover either marital counseling or even family therapy. Anyway, that's just my griping right now. So,
Mark, I have a new goal in life. Like, my new goal is to get marriage counseling covered. I mean, what is more important to society than your family of origin unit? Even if you
well, I
choose
think
not.
that I agree with you, and I think that what you have to do is you have to create research projects, and it's all about money.
Yeah.
That shows that if you have healthy marriages, then there are all these other costs that go down related to health and divorce and the kids. It's hard on kids.
Yeah.
I mean, so there are all these things that
Right.
are positively related, but until the insurance company sees that there's actually a number attached to it, a dollar number, then
Mm,
they won't budge on it. So you're right, there isn't a lot of work that's done with lower socioeconomic couples, but what stands out to me is their stresses are higher, their economic
yeah.
stresses are higher. And nowadays, that at least in our country, the divide between wealth and no wealth is really widening.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of people who really struggle. They can't afford health care. They have trouble, putting food on the table, rent. I mean, there are all these things that are high stress.
Yeah.
And as we've said before, that the higher the stress, the harder it is, well, one, to feel sexual, the harder it is to be compassionate toward each other because you've got all these other things going on. And so I don't want to get too political. I don't think we have a very good social safety net in our
Hmm.
country. And I think this is it,
Yeah.
that it affects couples and it affects children.
Yeah.
And we really need to realize that it's a negative.
Yeah. I mean, think of what the world would be like if more parents stayed together. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that every couple should. I mean, I understand that there are people who get married and maybe it wasn't ever a good marriage in the first place, but I mean, if more couples had access to help to be able
Yeah.
to change the behaviors that they need to make their relationship successful, it's going to make a big difference. And so this leads us really well into a great segue into next week's episode,
We,
which is families of origin. And part of the reason why I want to talk about this is, again, this is something I'm studying in school. But one thing that fascinates me is couples like me and you, Mark, who didn't have the best marital examples growing up and yet still have successful marriages.
Well, it goes to this. I mean, the words you use are high growth orientation. It's the realization that you do not have to be stuck in your parents' patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm definitely not stuck in my parents' patterns. And so,
same. Yeah.
And so for couples, or for people, individuals to realize you can change it is important. I love talking about families of origin, so I'm looking forward to this.
Yes, me too. And I also want to, make sure people understand this is, and especially as we get into next week, this is not me bashing my parents at all, because I love and I appreciate them, and I have a very good relationship with them. And they gave me a wonderful childhood, but they will also own that for many, many years, their relationship was very, very poor, their own relationship. So we're going to get into all of that next week. It's going to be a really good episode, and we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.